If you're just starting out in the world of hardware synths, one of the first things that you're likely to run into is the big question: how many voices should my synth have? Now, I remember the moment when I learned that not all synths had multiple voices, and I couldn't for the life of me understand why anybody would want a keyboard that couldn't play chords. Then, it wasn't just a matter of how many voices, there was this whole polyphonic versus paraphonic debacle. Today, we're going to go back to the basics of synths and explain everything you ever wanted to know about synth voicing, but were afraid to ask.
Hi, welcome to the Midlight Synthesist. Let's get started.
Okay, so the first thing I think we need to do is define what voicing is and what is generally understood when we talk about monophonic, paraphonic, and polyphonic synths. When we classify synths in that way, we're talking about how many voices can be played at the same time. I feel it's really important to stress that there's a big difference between a voice, an oscillator, and a note. And I'm going to use the Pro 3 to exemplify the difference here. In its most basic form, a subtractive synthesizer's first building block is the sound source, and that is called the oscillator. That sound source can be played at a certain pitch, which will produce a musical note. A voice might be understood as the individual sound that is generated when I hold down a single key. But instead of just trying to explain this difference, let me show it to you on the Pro 3. Now, the Pro 3 is a monophonic synth, which means that I can only play one voice at a time. If I try to play another note on top of it while I'm playing, depending on the current settings, it will either hold the note or pass to the new one, but it won't make two independent sounds or voices. However, the Pro 3 does have 3 oscillators, which can be pitched differently, and therefore that single voice can play up to 3 different musical notes at the same time, while still being considered only one voice. Let me show you. When I hold down a key, this is a note, it's one voice, and right now I'm currently hearing just one oscillator. If I turn on a second oscillator, and the menu here is really helpful, I have oscillator 1, which is the full volume, oscillator 2, you can hear how it's stacking the same note, right? So what we're going to do, so we can hear it more clearly, I'm going to pitch it up an octave. Can you hear it? That's oscillator 2. That's oscillator 1. 1 octave apart. Now, if I turn on oscillator 3, let's pitch it down an octave. You hear that bass note? So right now we have one voice, 3 oscillators, and 3 notes. It's really important not to confuse a voice with a note, because in this case, since I have 3 oscillators, I can, with one voice, play 3 notes. For example, a chord, minor or major. So what I'm going to do here for the example is I'm going to tune oscillator 2 a whole 5th up. That's a 5th. And oscillator 3, I'm going to tune to a 3rd. Major 3rd, minor 3rd. Major 3rd, minor 3rd. So I'm playing a whole chord with just one voice. But as long as they're all set off by me pressing just one key, this remains a strictly mono synth. The Pro 3 does have a very neat trick up its sleeve though. By pressing this button right here, I can go into Paraphonic Mode, which means that I can trigger all 3 oscillators independently by playing 3 keys. But wait a minute, I know what you're thinking. Wouldn't that mean that we have 3 voices now? How come it isn't considered a polysynth then? Well, as we were saying before, in subtractive synthesis, the sound that comes out of the oscillator will be sculpted by a filter and by an amplifier, each with their own envelopes controlling their behavior. Now, to be honest, the real definition is kind of hazy in terms that it will vary from person to person on what true polyphony and paraphony are. But it would seem that the general consensus is that paraphony occurs when the oscillators share the same filter and amplifier envelopes, whereas in polyphony, each voice has its own envelope or articulation, if you will. In broader terms, in paraphony, you aren't playing independent voices, you're playing each oscillator directly, which give this type of synth a few limitations as well as a few very desirable qualities. Now, to really get my point across, let me first show you a true polyphonic synth, and then we can go back to the Pro 3 and dig back deeper into this whole paraphony business. By the way, if you're enjoying this type of content, please let me know in a comment below, and if you would be so kind, I would really appreciate it if you take a second to click that like and maybe subscribe if you want to hang out with me in a future video. Thanks. Okay, so this little guy right here is the Arturia Polygroup. It's a 6-voice analog polysynth. That means that I can play up to 6 voices independently. And if you look at the front panel, you might be surprised that I only have 2 oscillators. How can I have 6 voices with only 2 oscillators? Well, I actually have 12 oscillators, 2 per voice. So basically 6 groups of 2s. And the same goes for the filter and the amplifier envelopes. They function independently, giving each voice its own articulation. This is better exemplified when playing various keys at various velocities. Notice the nuances and the organic expressiveness that I can get out of each voice as it reacts differently to my playing. I want to take a minute to thank Perfect Circuit for helping me get my hands on this Pro 3. Where I live, it's really hard to get a hold of synths of this kind of pedigree and caliber, and the great folks at Perfect Circuit have really helped me to keep this channel running, both by sending me gear and also with their affiliate program, which you can check out in the links in the description. They sell all kinds of synthesizers, Eurorack modules, and guitar pedals, and they also ship worldwide, so be sure to check them out before you leave in the links below. Once again, thank you Perfect Circuit for supporting me and other creators like me on this platform. Okay, so back to the Pro 3. I'm in Paraphonic Mode and I made this little patch so we can demo it. If you want to play chords on it, I suggest that you pitch them all the same, because if not, it can get very messy. Now it's behaving pretty much like a polysynth, a 3-voice polysynth, but it doesn't have the same articulation as on a polysynth because the envelopes aren't being triggered in the same way as a polygroup. That's not always a bad thing, mind you. Having a shared filter and amplitude envelopes give it a particular sound which can work wonderfully in some situations. However, it might not be what you want if you need more expression and articulation on each individual voice, and if you're looking for, more elaborate piano playing. Now, I have my 3 oscillators tuned differently. I'll start playing the same key, C, and the note's gonna change. So this, in a piano, would always sound the same. The reason why it sounds differently is because it's cycling through each one of the oscillators, and since they're tuned differently, they have a different musical note relative to the key that I'm pressing. Depending on the synth that you're using, you can either set it up to cycle or to just play the lowest note or the highest note. There are a few options. And the cool thing about that, and a very nice thing about the paraphonic synths, is that it can lead to very strange and unexpected melodies if you're running a sequence. For example, doesn't always mean it's good, but hey, at least it's different. So the big question is, if I can have a synth with 6 voices at almost the same price as one with 1, isn't the 6th voice a much better deal? Why would I want an instrument that can't play chords? To explore this, we first need to think about why the monophonic synth still exists in the first place. I mean, with the current technology, shouldn't every synth be polyphonic? Well, no. And it's mainly because of the way that sound behaves and what happens when you start piling on the waves. Think about when you're in a crowded restaurant. The murmur of multiple conversations starts to blend into one, and it all becomes just a cloud of sound that makes it impossible to really hear any one particular conversation. So when designing a polyphonic instrument, the engineers have to take special care with the frequencies and gain staging so that the voices don't drown each other out, so that they all fit through the filter and the amplifier while maintaining a certain level of clarity and definition. That's why you'll probably sometimes hear people refer to a polyphonic synthesizer's individual voices as thin or without that much bottom end, which is not a bad thing because of the way that they function. They're designed that way on purpose. On the other hand, a monosynth like the Pro 3 can make each oscillator really count, as there will be only one voice roaring out this filter. And that's why you'll usually see monosynths being used in bass lines or lead melodies, because that one voice is earth-shattering. Now, to further drive in my point, consider the following. The human voice is a monophonic instrument. You can't sing a chord by yourself, you'd need backup singers. So if you ever feel that you're getting shortchanged by having just one voice instead of lots of them, I ask you, Would you rather have 6 voices like the Backstreet Boys, which are fine, or would you have just one voice like Freddie Mercury? All right! And the answer is all of them, of course. But seriously, the truth about both types of synths is that they're both amazing and necessary. And the cool part is, when thoughtfully combined, they work incredibly well together. I know that in this video I seem to be defending the monophonic synth a lot, but only because I remember what it was like when I started out and I completely mistook its value and its function. So to answer that last question, when and in what scenario would you want to use a monophonic and a polyphonic synthesizer? Personally, the monosynth holds a special place in my heart for 2 reasons. I find that in general, it's much easier to program and get your head around sound design if you're just focusing on one voice at a time. My absolutely favorite synth to program sound right now is the Pro 3, and before that it was the Moog Grandmother. Both monophonic, both insanely easy to understand but really deep to go into. Monosynths can generally make for huge bass sounds and ripping leads. Just consider bass guitars and lead rock guitar solos that are usually played monophonically so that those single notes really stand out and move you. The other huge and maybe not so obvious benefit of jamming on a monophonic synth is that you usually play with one hand and have another one free to live tweak your synth. It really helps the instrument shine and makes it different than playing other instruments where you have one set sound that, since you're using both hands, you aren't that free to tweak around like on the Polygroup. In monosynths, I find it easier to make the sound design a part of your performance, a real integral part of your playing. As for polysynths, I usually use them kind of like the floor on which my song is built on, be it lush pads or strings or plucked chords, just a full richness of multiple voices combined with modulations that make them evolve and change over time, and that makes for truly engaging and evolving soundscapes where I can lay on, the monosynth. As for the amount of voices, it really depends on what you'll be playing and what style you want. Since I usually pair up my Pro 3 or my Subsequent 37 to my Polygroup, I find that I'm just fine with 6 voices. And also, I'm not a very fast or skilled keyboard player. However, if you so happen to be a very skilled keyboard player and you're going to be playing lots of notes real fast, or maybe these evolving pads or strings with very long tails that merge into each other, 6 voices might not cut it, because it'll lead to some ugly voice stealing, which is that sudden silencing of that note you were playing because the synth needs to, start a new one. If that's the case, maybe 16 voices will be better suited. Now, if I had to recommend a monosynth for beginners, I'd look at the Korg Monologue or the Novation Bass Station. Both analog synths, which I favor in monosynths, as well as amazingly powerful and not overpriced for what they bring to the table. My favorite paraphonic synth is by far the Arturia Microfig. I have a full video review on it if you want to check it out. And finally, if you're looking for a polysynth, I would actually recommend trying out virtual instruments, unless you really need the physical hardware. Polysynths like the Arturia Pigments and Serum are insanely fun and sound incredible for the price, so be sure to check those out. As for analog versus digital, let me know in the comments if you'd like me to make a video on that one and I'll get back to work. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this video useful or at least entertaining. Have a great week. See you next time.